In 1963, a single warehouse in Bahr, New Jersey, claimed to hold more soybean and cottonseed oil than existed in the entire United States. The banks believed it. They loaned $180 million against it, and every gallon was a lie. You're listening to The Unlit Room. Every story in here actually happened. That's the part that should scare you. New stories every day, Monday through Saturday. This episode's narration is AI-generated. The research, writing, and editorial decisions behind every story are made with care for accuracy and respect for those involved. Today, the fraud that was hidden in plain sight, until someone finally looked below the surface. Anthony Tino De Angelis grew up in the Bronx, the son of Italian immigrants. By the early 1960s, he was running Allied Crude Vegetable Oil, a major commodities broker operating out of a massive refinery complex on the Bayonne waterfront. Dozens of cylindrical storage tanks rose several stories high across the facility, each one painted industrial gray, connected by a network of pipes and valves. The smell of vegetable oil hung thick in the air. De Angelis was gregarious, heavy-set, always willing to show inspectors around. And Allied had an impressive client, the United States government. Through the Food for Peace program, Allied shipped vegetable oil to developing nations. It was legitimate business, profitable business, the kind that made banks comfortable. Allied used its inventory as collateral. Standard practice in commodities trading. You store physical goods in a warehouse, you get a receipt certifying how much you have, and you use those receipts to secure loans. Simple, safe. The oil was right there in the tanks, and Allied had a lot of tanks. By 1963, Allied had posted 900,000 short tons of vegetable oil as collateral. That's 1.8 billion pounds. Against that inventory, Allied had secured $180 million in loans from major financial institutions. American Express Warehousing certified the receipts. The banks were satisfied. But here's the thing about 900,000 tons of oil. That's more than the entire United States produced in a year. One facility in Bayonne, New Jersey, was supposedly storing more cottonseed and soybean oil than existed in the whole country, and somehow everyone believed him. Bayonne sits on a peninsula jutting into Newark Bay, just across the water from Staten Island. It was an industrial town, refineries, warehouses, shipping terminals. The kind of place where big numbers didn't seem strange, where a forest of storage tanks looked like success. American Express Warehousing had inspectors. They came regularly. They climbed the metal ladders running up the sides of the tanks, opened the inspection hatches at the top, and dropped weighted measuring tapes, dipsticks, down into the tanks. When they pulled the tapes back up, they showed oil. The warehouse receipts were signed, certified, filed. Allied was American Express Warehousing's most profitable customer. So profitable that when American Express sold off the rest of its warehousing business, they kept Allied. Exclusive arrangement. No other clients. Just Allied and those tanks full of oil. What the inspectors didn't know was that some of those tanks had hidden internal compartments, reducing the actual capacity by 80% or more. What they didn't know was that the same oil was being pumped from tank to tank through underground pipes, staying just ahead of the inspection schedule. What they didn't know was that a dipstick can't tell the difference between a tank full of oil and a tank full of water with a thin film of oil floating on top. De Angelis wasn't running a commodities business. He was running a magic show, and the banks were buying tickets. Micro cliffhanger 1. But here's what makes this more than just fraud. The fake oil wasn't the end game. It was the bankroll. By November 14, 1963, Allied Crude Vegetable Oil owned 90% of all cottonseed oil futures contracts on the New York Produce Exchange. 90%. De Angelis wasn't just hiding a fraud, he was trying to corner the entire market. The plan was elegant in its audacity. If he could control enough of the supply, he could drive prices up. The futures contracts would explode in value. He'd make enough to cover the fabricated inventory, repay the loans, and walk away clean. Maybe even rich. The floor of the produce exchange was crowded, chaotic, traders shouting orders, cigarette smoke thick in the air, price boards flickering with the latest quotes. Day AN had bet everything on one outcome, that the United States Senate would approve a wheat deal with the Soviet Union, which would push grain prices up and take cottonseed oil along for the ride. On November 15th, two things happened. First, the Commodity Exchange Authority announced it was investigating Allied's futures market activities. Second, the Senate suspended debate on the Soviet wheat deal. The floor realized what was about to happen. Everyone tried to sell at once. By the close of trading, cottonseed oil futures had collapsed. Allied faced millions in immediate margin calls. Money it didn't have, backed by oil that didn't exist. 3 days later, Allied crude vegetable oil filed for bankruptcy. Bankruptcy filings are usually quiet bureaucratic events. Lawyers file paperwork, creditors get in line. But Allied's bankruptcy was different, because the creditors wanted to see the collateral. They wanted to verify the inventory, they wanted to open the tanks. November 19th through 22nd, 1963. Grey, cold, late autumn weather on the Bayonne waterfront. Inspectors arrived with sledgehammers and cutting torches. No more dipsticks, no more taking Allied's word for it. News of President Kennedy's assassination on November 22nd dominated the radio broadcasts while the inspectors worked. But inside the refinery complex, another kind of devastation was unfolding. The inspectors drilled into the tanks. Water gushed from the valves. Some tanks were completely empty, sealed to look full. Others had hidden compartments, massive internal walls that reduced the actual storage space to a fraction of what the exterior dimensions suggested. And the rest, the ones that had fooled the dipsticks for years, were exactly what Day AN had bet no one would check. Tanks filled with water. Just water. New Jersey tap water, with a thin floating layer of vegetable oil on top, just enough to fool a measuring tape, just enough to pass a visual inspection from the top hatch, just enough to keep the lie alive. Day AN had literally bet that no one would look below the surface, and for years no one did. The math was devastating. Allied had claimed 900,000 short tons of inventory. The actual amount in the tanks was 55,000 tons. A 94% fabrication rate, almost nothing was real. American Express Warehousing filed for bankruptcy with $130,000 in assets against $210 million in claims. Their stock dropped by a third, $80 million in value erased overnight. The brokerage firm Ira Haupt became insolvent when the New York Stock Exchange force liquidated it to protect 20,000 customer accounts. Partners who'd spent their careers building the firm lost everything. Day AN son, Thomas, withdrew $700,000 in questionable checks during the bankruptcy proceedings. At least $20 million was never accounted for. Federal investigators found $500,000 in a Swiss-numbered bank account. The rest vanished. Micro cliffhanger 2. Day AN was arrested. He was tried. On August 18, 1965, he pled guilty to 4 counts of fraud and conspiracy. The judge sentenced him to 20 years in federal prison. He served 7. Here's the part that should keep you up. This wasn't a sophisticated hack or a brilliant forgery. It was water in a tank. The inspectors had the tools to catch it. The banks had the resources to verify it. American Express Warehousing had every incentive to look closely. Their entire business depended on those receipts being accurate. But Allied was profitable. Day AN was charming. The checks cleared. And when something is making everyone money, the last thing anyone wants to do is ask the hard question. American Express Warehousing trusted dipstick measurements and signed receipts. They never asked to open the tanks. By the time they did, it was too late. The line between verification and willful blindness is thinner than you think. And it's measured in how badly you want to believe the surface is all there is. Day AN walked out of prison in the early 1970s. He never told them where the missing $20 million went. He died in 2009, 93 years old, at home in New Jersey. Some secrets stay below the surface forever. If this one made you rethink trust, good. New stories every day, Monday through Saturday. Subscribe so the next one finds you too. That was the Unlit Room. See you in the dark.